Welcome to Coming Home, Survive and Thrive in Homeschooling. Teaching art, art history and history using galleries, museums and churches. At My Mother's Knee by Bridget Boland. I have already referred to this book in earlier podcasts. It was never recommended to me, but rather found as a hidden jewel in a library sale. I was attracted to this book for a few reasons. Firstly, the title, At My Mother's Knee. As someone who viewed her motherhood and homeschooling as a career, the title immediately drew me in. The dust jacket talked of her Irish father as a politician during the time of the Easter uprising. There is much in the book regarding this and is of interest to anyone with an Irish background, like me. This was enough for me to choose the book, even if there weren't the following reasons. Published in 1978, with the author born in 1913, I could see she was well educated. Reading the first few paragraphs of the first chapter confirmed that I had indeed found a good book. Necessary criteria had been met. In Chapter 1, I stumbled on how the mother as a child and then her children learned art and history and so much more from the simple but strategic immersion in the art of Europe's galleries, museums and churches. And then, for her children, in London. Bridget's story fits the Charlotte Mason principles. It truly is a living book. This became more important to me than the Irish history I learned. I could put into my own words what Bridget wrote, but she's much more able than me. What I read to you can be used by any family travelling and homeschooling with the world as their classroom. I begin with a preamble of Bridget's mother's experience of travel and art, leading into how she in turn taught her children. She had had a geography book in the nursery which stated categorically that in Australia the flowers have no scent and the birds have no song, and had thereafter decided that the only thing to do was to go to places yourself. To places she certainly went. From the convent boarding school in Roehampton, to which she was now sent, she always, apart from an occasional trip to Australia, spent the holidays with her parents wherever in Europe they might be. They lived an entirely nomadic existence, moving from hotel to hotel. Her father had qualified as both a barrister and a doctor with a view to becoming an expert in forensic medicine, but he did not practice long in either capacity. Money was luckily no object, and he lavished all his time on a passionate enjoyment of art. She adored him, and went with him everywhere he would take her, and where he took her was to see things, particularly in art galleries and churches. He would march round a piece of sculpture, she told me, rhapsodizing over its anatomical perfections, brandishing his walking stick to point them out, to the alarm of attendants on duty who would follow him nervously from piece to piece. Then he would suddenly demand a chair, or even, if the piece was large enough, a ladder. He had a passion for ears. He had once alarmed Nellie Melba at dinner by staring fixedly at her ear all the evening, tilting his chair back to continue to examine it when she turned her head to speak to him. He had a theory that an ear for music started in the outer whirls of its structure. He also had a theory that ears revealed criminal tendencies, and that those of statues showed that sculptors had used members of the criminal classes as models. "He's really quite safe," my mother would whisper to an attendant, and coax him into bringing a chair for Papa to stand on, so long as the stick was left on the ground. Above all, though, she came to know the great galleries of Europe as well as any guide, and she felt that she could give us at least the galleries of London in the same way. I was 8 when she first took me into the National Gallery. Just before we reached the top of the stairs, she told me to close my eyes and take her hand. We lived quite near the National and even nearer to the Tate Gallery. But always until now to go inside was a treat promised for when you're old enough. The only real pictures we had at home were portraits of my mother and her 3 older children, and we were always told that the Medici prints and the reproductions in books that we had were nothing like the real thing, which in those days of poor colour processes was indeed true. The moment when each child was old enough to enjoy the real thing was carefully gauged. I would not for the world have piqued and spoiled the surprise as my mother led me by the hand. The pictures would be much, much larger than the prints and reproductions, of course, and I suppose much softer looking, for the real portraits of us at home were in a mixture of pastel and tempera, fashionably considered suitable for pictures of children at the time. But when my mother told me I could open my eyes, we were in a wonderland of jewel-bright colours, with storybook people in glorious clothes, living in castles and houses with arches and pillars and splendid hangings, with views through the windows of more castles and fascinating little uphill streets of more storybook houses, with little bright people hurrying about. I was enchanted and hurried from one Flemish, French or Italian primitive to another. They were best, of course, if you knew the story, and here was a nativity, for instance, but how much brighter and more exciting than the crib that was brought out every Christmas at home, with the colours of its little old Italian figures darkened by much handling over the years. There in the picture was a procession coming. That had to be the 3 kings. At home we ceremoniously always took the king's figures from their tissue paper and installed them on the Epiphany. And here in another picture the kings had already arrived. And such kings, with such gorgeous embroidered robes and such bejewelled golden crowns. "Here are some more kings over here," said my mother. "Which do you like best?" I have no idea how long we spent that first day among those very early paintings, except that it was not nearly long enough when my mother said, "Now close your eyes again," and led me away. When I was told to open them, it was like being plunged into icy water. We were standing in front of a huge picture, all black and white. A father and mother in black with huge white ruffs, and children all in black and white too, except for their rosy cheeks. After all those glorious colours and busy gay people in their wonderful world, the still solemnity of that worthy Dutch 17th century family was a shock that left me speechless. I stared for a long time. "But," I said at last, "I do rather like it too." "Thank God," said my mother, "that's enough for today." She whisked me out, and as a further treat to mark the occasion, we went home in a taxi. Going round in galleries with her father had been fun, and fun, above all, it must be for us. So first we looked mostly at story subjects, while she told us the stories, religious, mythological, or historical, that we didn't know. Then she would ask, perhaps, pretending that she couldn't remember, where we had seen the same story pictured before, and then go back to that room and look at it again, seeing how differently each painter saw the story. Sometimes we could go back to 2 or 3 rooms and compare, and decide who told the story best. The first time I recognised a story and exactly where to look for another version of it, my mother said, "Hooray! Now let's start looking for something else." What came next? I think it was places, looking particularly at the kind of places different painters chose to make the stories happen in, from the busy little medieval towns of my first loves, the primitives, through classical settings to romantic landscapes. From that we started looking for the way the landscapes were shown. There was an exciting day when we first had another doting look at the glimpses out of the windows of my beloved primitives in the National, and then, remember them, hold on to them, whisked in a taxi down to the Tate, and I was given my first sight of my mother's favourite Turner. On that occasion at least the shock effect was certainly achieved again, and I remember we walked home along the embankment, and my mother told me that before I was born she used to walk and walk there, soaking up the sky and river, in case what they said about prenatal influences was true, and she could implant delight in them in my unborn mind. My mother always encouraged you to like whatever picture you liked, and was immensely interested to hear why you liked it, and could always see just what you meant, and it would remind her of another picture by the same painter or of the same subject somewhere else, and we would go off to some other gallery to see it. I had a blind spot. The French Impressionists at the Tate, particularly Bathers in the Seine, which she loved, and I thought flat, colourless, and plain ugly. She didn't force them on me, but drew me out on what I didn't like about them, thereby, of course, causing me to look at them for longer. "It's as if they couldn't see properly," I objected. "Why didn't they get glasses?" It wasn't till some 40 years later that I read Patrick Trevor Roper's World Through Blunted Sight, and was pleased to find that my diagnosis had been correct, but then was startled to see, in quotations from Monet and Renoir, the gist of what my mother had answered me. Perhaps they tried glasses and liked the world better without them. Because each child was different, and at each age was at a different stage of development, we each, when young, always went alone with her to galleries, so that she could concentrate on what would give each the most pleasure. My own abiding passion for medieval paintings led her early to take me to the British Museum's display of illuminated manuscripts, where I could dote on the enchanting little pictures that adorned them. This seemed to her natural enough, but when we went to the Tate, the fact that I fell in love as soon as I was shown them with Rossetti and company astonished her. She did not care for them at all herself. She told me later that she had been excited then to realise suddenly what I saw in them. You had never heard of pre-Raphaelitism, but obviously you were seeing what they had in common with your primitives. To my eye, it was all overlaid with Victorian romanticism, but when you fastened with delight on the precision of details in some flowers in the grass, the pattern of a damask robe, I wanted to ring up heaven and get poor Rossetti on the line and tell him he had pulled it off after all, to the seeing eye of a child. She treasured all the discovery remarks we made, such as my sister on looking at Claude. "I like it when they paint the air. That one smells of mist in it." And my own on first seeing Van Gogh's chair in the Tate. "It's frightening. He's mad." I think it was because she listened every bit as much as she talked, that when you looked at pictures with her, that gallery going never struck me as an educational exercise. It was a shared, joyous experience, like going to a circus. One game, my favourite, that we used to play in galleries or with her books and postcards at home, was called Going for a Walk in a Picture. This was also developed from her own lonely girlhood abroad. By the time she was 14 or so, my grandmother was almost completely blind, but still trekked from hotel to hotel in the wake of her ever-travelling husband, with my mother in tow. Now that my mother had seen much of Europe, she began to recognise, during the hours she spent looking at pictures, buildings, and corners of streets and squares that she knew incorporated in the paintings, she began to collect postcards everywhere she went, to better identify such originals. She showed me how an artist had incorporated such a tower or dome or archway in Rome or Florence or Milan in his concept of Jerusalem, or such a street in Antwerp out of a window in his painting of an interior. Or we would find a reproduction of the painting in one of her books and hunt through albums of postcards till we identified it. This led on to our playing the game she had invented for herself of walking into the canvas and reconstructing if we knew, or imagining if we didn't, what would be round the next corner, just out of sight in the painting. The pictures became three-dimensional. You could walk about in them for ages. As I came to know more about the kinds of houses people lived in at different times, we would walk in through open doorways too, and discuss what the rooms would be like, what the people would be doing, whether there would be a courtyard at the back. Would it have a pump, or a fountain, or even a little paved garden like the one in such and such another painting? It never occurred to me for an instant that I was learning a good deal about other things besides paintings from all of this, about architecture and geography and social life and costume and furniture and weapons and armour and even the development of cooking utensils. The fun of the game was to know exactly what to see inside those houses or round those corners that would fit with the rest of the picture, to chase off to some other remembered picture and see whether this or that scene in it could indeed fairly be included. Such games as these and Guess the Painter or Guess the Date other people must have played in galleries, but there was one which I am sure was unique to our family. It was called Saints. My mother, in her visits to churches wherever she went, had of course always looked at the paintings and sculpture. Her father, when he went with her, was always interested in the work of art itself and its contents rather than its subject. Once, when he was admiring the superb accuracy of veins and arthritic limbs in a picture of an aged man, my mother, then very young, had asked him, "But how do you know it's St. Jerome?" They were in a church, not a gallery, and there was no title under the painting. "Because he's an old hermit living in a cave, and he's got a tame lion. But look at the swollen knuckles of that left hand. He gets a lot of pain, poor boy." It was the fact that the presence of a tame lion made it St. Jerome that intrigued my mother, and she wanted to know more about that. She got St. Jerome's story and those of other saints from her mother. St. Catherine of Alexandria would have had a spiked wheel at her side and often a sword in her hand. St. Catherine of Siena would hold or wear a ring. St. Barbara would have a miniature tower as a symbol of her imprisonment. Two young men dressed as doctors with scarlet robes and caps would be St. Cosmos and St. Damien, and a deacon with a gridiron would be St. Lawrence, who was burned to death on one. In London, Cromwell and such had knocked everything about too much, and such few old churches as there were mostly filled only with what my mother lumped together as dead Protestants. My mother had developed the game further in her own girlhood when she found out about donors. These, she explained, were the people who had donated a picture to a church and whose Christian names, at any rate, could often be identified by the saints shown in the picture. Say there was a Madonna and Child in the middle with a number of saints, and a man kneeling on the right-hand side of the picture, and perhaps a woman kneeling on the other, sometimes with children kneeling as well, the boys behind their fathers, the girls behind their mothers. If the saint on the right nearest the central figures was a bishop, say carrying 3 small bags or gold balls, he would be St. Nicholas, namesaint of the man kneeling in the foreground. The nearest woman saint to the central figures on the other side would be the patroness of the wife of the donor, St. Lucy perhaps. A kindly German professor who had met my mother in a hotel in Florence explained to her how you could often date a building or a picture by the arms of a pope on it, unless it were a Medici pope, for instance, because there were several. She could sometimes add the surname to the Christian name of the donor if she looked carefully for the coat of arms somewhere in the picture, in a stained glass window in the background perhaps. To me, paintings were real places, real people. I hated the idea of the painter's version having to be recreated by tedious fiddling mechanics. It spoilt the magic. Yet years and years later, when picture cleaning and restoration became my hobby, and I had to learn about techniques, even from this area, she had failed to interest me and quickly stopped, I used to hear echoes of the things she had said. How the jewel brightness of the early paintings I loved was achieved by painting layer after layer of the same colour very thinly on top of the other, sort of trapping the light in between the layers to make them glow. And look how Claude paints a tiny brown cross on the white in the middle of his golden sun. It makes it spin. That's what dazzles. It must have sunk into my subconsciousness, but at the time what she showed me was the sun itself. I hope these excerpts I have read to you from At My Mother's Knee have inspired you to look at galleries, museums and churches in a different way. I have certainly found it encouraging myself, and if you ever happen to come upon the book at a library sale or you find it on Amazon or something, I suggest you snap it up.